Today I'm here with Dennis James Sweeney. Dennis is a lecturer in the English department at Amherst College, and he is also an author who has a book titled How to Submit coming out next month. Dennis, it's great to be speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So that was my mini introduction, but it's of course not comprehensive. So I want to start by asking if you want to give a brief overview of who you are and the work that you do.
For sure. So there's many different parts of who I am, I guess, but because you mentioned the academic part of it, currently I teach at Amherst College, so I teach classes in fiction writing and creative nonfiction and cross-genre writing, like hybrid forms. So that's kind of what I do in an academic sense, in the sense of a writer, which is kind of the identity that I've used and inhabited for the last 12, 15 years, something like that. I'm a person who writes across many genres. I've written books of kind of combining poetry and fiction, a book combining poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. I have this novella that came out last year, and then this most recent book is a piece about kind of guiding writers to learn about the landscape of literary magazines and small presses and to help people get published in those communities. And those are the kind of the communities that have given to me a lot as a writer. They've been the places where I publish my writing and also the places where I've found the writing that I've read that has meant the most to me. So right now I'm really in this spirit of trying to give back some of what the literary community gave to me and help teach people a little bit more about how to engage with that community and what it can look like to be involved with it through publishing, whether you're a writer publishing your work with them or whether you're running one of these presses or being a part of the operating of a literary magazine or something like that too.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, you've done a lot of work relating to publishing, and I think the small press database at Amherst College, which is sort of a collection of small presses where people can get published. So I want to start by talking about this book that's coming out, and you kind of gave a bit of the background as to the inspiration and what made you interested in it. But can you talk a little bit about the work that you were doing with the small press database and that type of stuff before publishing this book? Basically, the how to submit type stuff before the actual book.
It's a great question, and it started a long time before the small press database at Amherst College began. So one of the first things that I did as a writer, of course, I was writing the whole time, but I was also realizing that I wanted to be a part of that community in ways that weren't just publishing my writing and then getting out of the way. I wanted to contribute to the community. I wanted to be part of the conversation. So really early in my writing life, I started writing book reviews, and those led to opportunities at other literary publications, and I ended up working for this website called Entropy, really volunteering for them and helping to assemble this list called the Where to Submit list, which was kind of initially a small and then eventually a giant list of a bunch of different venues where people can publish their writing. So it became this really big resource that got shared around across social media and became kind of a trusted, dependable place for people to go to submit their writing. And in the course of doing that, I realized, oh my gosh, this is this amazing thing that people really want. It's a type of resource that folks really want to key in on, and especially if it's coming from kind of a trusted source, which Entropy was before it shut down a couple years ago. Alongside that work, I was also interviewing small presses. I interviewed like 220 small presses over the course of several years, also for Entropy, and got the experience of talking to these editors and hearing about how they were running their operations. And there's so many different ways they do it. Some people have kind of a larger sort of small press that is operating in a nonprofit way that gets funding from outside organizations. Some people, it's like one or two people in their basement hand sewing chapbooks and printing them out, printing silkscreen covers and then sending them to their friends. So there's a lot of different ways that people can inhabit that world. So through that work of Where to Submit and through interviewing all these small presses, I just got really enthusiastic about that whole scene. And of course, I was reading these books and then writing books and shorter pieces that were influenced by them that whole time. So when it came to Amherst, Entropy had recently closed down, and I was trying to think about what's the next step. Like, how do I take this passion for this really foundational part of the literary scene and do something with it that incorporates my academic context. So I got a few students together and we had some research funding, and I used the research funding to pay the students to gather a lot of information about small presses and sort of compile it into this database that basically gave information about a lot of different small presses. And we organized it on the basis of where they were located, who was running the presses, identity specific tags that helped certain communities figure out presses that were going to be focused on them. And things like, we didn't include things like reading periods as much because it wasn't as much about submitting. It was more about like reading and discovering. But it was a really interesting pursuit and a lot of fun to do with these students. Alongside that, I was also like, okay, here's this academic thing that I can do with small presses, and I can write a book about this because I felt like it was the next thing. There's a lot of submission resources online, and a lot of things you can find, but it's gotten to the point where there's so much, it's hard to figure out what to do. It's hard to make sense of all that's out there. So I wanted to have a single place where you could go. And in the book and in my own online postings and stuff, I direct people to other resources and kind of try to make sense of some of the resources that are out there. But I also try to be kind of a unified voice, not the only voice, not the voice that knows everything, but instead, kind of a guide to the process of submitting your writing. So that became the big thing that a lot of these activities of mine have hovered around, but it's kind of coming from this desire to contribute to the community, to just learn a lot about the landscape, and basically from the feeling of just being a really big fan of what all these folks are doing.
So, simply put, the book is on how to submit. I guess my question would be, what is the difference between, let's say your book and one of those submission guides online, where you could write an article or something, but this is obviously much more in depth. So, what would you say is the distinction? Is it more comprehensive? It kind of tackles all different types of genres, or it's just the only thing you need, so to speak, if you're looking to submit? I guess, what is the like? Why not write let's say an online post?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think part of it is that I'm a person who likes books, and I think a lot of the people who are involved in submitting their writing and writing books also like books. Like I want a book. When I was first starting out, I would have loved to have something I can hold in my hands, and it's 200 pages long, and if I read it, I'm going to have a really good sense of what's going on. So just having something in a book format can really make a big difference. But I think the thing in terms of content that it really adds is the idea of like a guiding voice and kind of a philosophy around the idea of submissions. When you look online, you can find all these resources that tell you where to submit, like the one that I curated for a long time. And those are really helpful. And there's people who are really devoted to alerting you to new magazines and new presses. And I haven't even been able to keep up with the amazing flourishing of all these types of places that are coming around. But the thing that I've keyed in on instead is thinking about, what does this mean to us? Like, what can it mean for writers, and how do you look at it in a bigger picture way? So the thing that the book is trying to contribute is zooming out a little bit, and particularly asking folks, what are your goals? What are you trying to do by submitting your writing? And what's the purpose of this work that we're doing together? I kind of open space for people to have multiple different answers to that question, but one of my own personal answers to it is about connection and community. So it's really easy to get wrapped up in the idea of prestige and trying to get published in the best place and trying to be famous or whatever we all want to be, and we're sharing ourselves with the world. But I think underlying those desires, which are totally valid and legitimate, is maybe a deeper sense of wanting to connect with other people and wanting to find community. And that's something that you can pursue without having to tack all that other stuff onto it, like prestige, making a certain amount of money, or finding a certain type of like career result or something like that. Those things are important and we need to survive in the world. But I prioritize thinking about community and thinking about small presses, especially because that's what they've given to me. When I work with people who are publishing literary magazines and small presses, a lot of times they're just coming from this space like, I'm really excited about this. You're really excited about this. Let's do this together. And it's going to be super fun. It's not going to be about the market. It's not going to be about making it into like a deal, a quid pro quo kind of situation. Instead, it's going to be about we both love the same thing and we're going to work together to do different parts of the labor that builds up to this product that people can read, or to this reading that people can go to, or this community people can inhabit. So that's been really inspiring to me. And I think adding that framing to the whole submission process is something I really want to do.
So it talks about the logistics and the mechanics of how do you actually submit, but it also is supplementing that with the bigger picture and, like you said, the framing of, okay, what am I trying to achieve? What am I actually doing here? Um, so you talk about small presses and the impact they've had on you and the work you've done with them. I guess the question for me would be, when does it make sense to, let's say, go with a small press versus a bigger press, right? Because obviously it's the classic question of even big company versus small company. It's like you get more, let's say, personalized attention, and you maybe get treated as more of a you get more, I don't want to say respect, but it's more collaborative. Like you said, it's more of a shared interest. Typically, if it's just simply by the fact that there's less people that are also needing help with a smaller, let's say, organization in general, and then with let's say big organization or company, press, group. This is kind of a meta concept. Is that okay? You might get less personalized attention, but their selling point is that they have more, let's say, distribution or more built-in resources. So I guess, is that how you would mainly characterize the difference between small and big organization in the publishing world? And if so, how do you decide which makes sense for you?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think you're right that the sort of level of respect that is accorded to people sometimes depends on their publication circumstances, right? And it's just a reality of the world we live in, a reality of how people perceive things, because larger organizations, people have heard of them, smaller ones, less people have heard of them, right? And you really answered your own question like in a beautiful way, right? I mean, you're right about all that stuff that you said about personalized attention versus like larger reach or something like that, right? Um, but I tend to think of it less in the sort of pros and cons sense, and more in the sense of like who you're trying to communicate with and who your audience is and who your community is. Obviously, I'm coming back to this question of community. I think of people who are publishing with a larger press not as people who are more successful or sort of thinking about leveraging the stuff that's going on at larger presses, particularly the big five houses. I just think of that writing as belonging to a certain community of writers. Like if you're writing a certain kind of literary fiction, there's certain houses that'll publish that. If you're writing practical nonfiction, like I am with this book, there's certain houses that'll publish that. And there's certain readers that you're trying to reach, right? If you're publishing prose poems about two fictional people wandering around in Antarctica getting lost with the titles of geographic coordinates in Antarctica with these kind of blank pages that are sort of trying to inhabit and imitate the idea of being lost in Antarctica itself, which is like my first book, that's a totally different audience, right? So I think of choosing to go with a small press for that work is something that I had decided on from the very, very beginning when I started writing it. I was like, this is the kind of work that I'm really excited to share with a group of people who are interested in hybrid genre work, who have a really close attention to language and also theme, and can tolerate some level of distance from a discernible plot with like the predictable beats that we often see. So that was a community that I was communicating with. And even when I was writing in the very first drafts of that kind of work, it was only possible because I knew that those communities existed, for example. My second book from Essay Press, which is a really influential press to me, was called You're the Woods Too, and it basically took nonfiction and totally added all these other genres to it and pushed the boundaries of what nonfiction can be, which is what all their work does. And I only knew that I could do that because I had read their books. And so that was a community that I was trying to communicate with through that piece. And I know that it's a smaller group of people, but like you said, there's personalized attention in terms of how you're working with editors and stuff like that, which is true. But there's also the personal nature of the contact that you have with the people that are reading the book, right? So I think readers who are coming to literary magazines and small presses, you might hear from them. You know, they might write to you and be like, let's be friends, right? Or you might see them at an event or something like that and have a really interesting conversation with them. You might be able to go really deep, really fast with how you converse and talk to somebody who's read your book in that kind of context. And sometimes the relationship can be a little more commodified or like a little more distant when you're speaking to a larger group of people, or when your audience is implicitly more quote unquote mainstream, right? And again, not to have that sort of mainstream, not mainstream binary. I just think they're different communities of people with kind of different goals and different ways of relating to each other, you know? So I think for different things that you're writing, you want to relate to your readers differently. And that's kind of how I'm thinking of it. Trying to think of it laterally instead of hierarchically.
Would you say that the difference in communities between a small press and, let's say, a major publishing house can be characterized as a major house having a, let's say, broader definition of community in the sense that it's less niche, less specific, and it's less trying to maybe be creative with a new style of writing or a very specific topic, and it's more about something that'll be generally appealing? Because the follow-up to that is, okay, are you losing a piece of the art, let's say, by trying to make it appeal to everyone? At least that's how I would naturally think of it. And of course there are, like Harry Potter, that was distributed everywhere. I don't know if that actually came from a major publishing house at first, but something like that. That's just to say that it doesn't mean that a book from a major house is bad, let's say, but it means that maybe it's less about trying to push the boundaries of the field or of literature. So, my question is, do you think that that difference in community can be characterized as just having a looser definition of community in the sense that they have less of a specific thing they're trying to push, and it's more about, hey, what will the people like?
Can I turn this question back around? I'll answer your question, but I am super curious about what you think about it too, in terms of, like you said, are you losing something by appealing to more people, right? I think that's like a question that gets asked a lot, and the assumed answer is yes. But I don't know if the answer is yes. I'm curious to hear your take on it in asking the question.
Yeah, I think not necessarily, because obviously there are themes that everyone has experience with. So let's say if you're writing about, or even just a story, like anyone has experience with, let's say, love or fear or whatever. So you can touch on those themes and have it not necessarily be losing something. I think probably the better distinction is, and it can be about the subject matter, but I think it's probably more so about writing style, because I guess in subject matter, okay, you could pick something that everyone has experience with, but depending on your style of writing, like let's just say very abstractly a story. You could write a story with some themes that everyone has experience with, but maybe you try and do it in a very creative way. And if it's a new style of writing, then maybe that more so fits a small press. Whereas if it's more of a, and again, I don't really have too much experience in this world, so maybe I'm mischaracterizing things or it doesn't make sense. But I think the answer is not necessarily. And if I had to make a distinction, it would probably be, depends if we're talking about the content or the themes, or the writing itself when we're talking about appealing to a mass audience. And I guess to be more specific, for writing style itself, like you mentioned with your book, you kind of blended fiction and nonfiction in an interesting new way. Even if the story itself, even if the themes are something that everyone can understand and has experience with, the way in which you wrote it, the style might be more suited for, let's say, based on this characterization, a small press. And because of that, it sort of follows that if you're going to be new and experimental or really try something with writing, it doesn't really fit a large press. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think that's a great answer to the question. I think you held a lot of space for the nuance of it there. It helps me formulate my own answer too. I'm thinking about a book like Moby Dick, which was Moby Dick is nuts. It is the weirdest book, right? It's like, how does this exist and how is it so popular? And why do so many people like it, right? There's just so many digressions and the writing can be so dense at times. And there's just these chapters just about how ships work and how whaling works. And it's just ridiculous. And, the context that was originally published in was not a widespread one. Melville was somewhat well known in his time, and I think people probably read that book, but it had nowhere near the level of fame. It was kind of rediscovered later on and made famous by a bunch of academics, then eventually spread around and became this like big book that we all read. And so the publishing context of that completely changed how it's interpreted, right? If I read that book and it was something that nobody had ever read before, and I was the only person who read it, I would say, I discovered this giant book from this tiny little press about whales, and it's so weird, and you can't even believe all the stuff that goes on. And that's how I'd be thinking about it, right? And now I read it as this canonical thing that everybody looked at. So I don't think there's actually too big of a distinction between what can be published with small presses versus large presses, or in like more coterie publishing contexts versus more mainstream ones. I think that there's a lot of really weird stuff that gets published by big five houses, and a lot of, I don't know, mainstream aesthetic stuff or stuff that could be published with big five houses that doesn't and ends up getting published with small presses. So I wouldn't draw like a really hard distinction between the things that people are publishing, even though if you're querying agents and stuff like that, in reality, there's certain things like poetry, for example, where they're always going to be like, no, we can't represent poetry. It's just not something that is going to sell. So I think that the way something appears in the world really changes how we look at it. If it comes from a big press and it's getting a lot of attention and stuff like that, we're going to have a different feeling about it than if it comes from like a smaller group of people. And if it comes to your house in a hand lettered mailer with a cute little wrapping situation and a broadside that was printed alongside the book or something like that, right? Which is what I always get when I order from small presses. I have a totally different feeling about those books. So I think I have to admit my own biases and my own preference for things that feel handmade, even if they're not fundamentally different from the things that feel more part of a large system. I was always a person who wasn't a good hipster because I never knew how to find the music that was cool that nobody knew about yet, but I sure wanted to. And if somebody else was doing something, if everybody else was doing something, I didn't want to do it. And for a while I thought, okay, maybe this is a silly thing about myself, but I think it's really legitimate because something that you have a unique relationship with, something that's your own relationship instead of like a more commodified or advertised relationship to it. I think that's a really beautiful type of relationship to have with art. And it's something that you really can't leave behind the publishing circumstances when you're thinking about that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of magic that I feel really good about participating in and kind of like giving extra voice to through this book. And I don't know if it answers your question or like resolves that question, right? Of what happens to our art when it's shared widely, but there's something that happens. Even when the art doesn't change, there's something that happens when the context changes.
Yeah, that makes sense, and probably isn't fair to make a black and white distinction saying that, oh, if you're at a large press, you're not really able to, let's say, push the boundaries or be creative in your writing style. My follow-up to that would be when we're talking about the difference in community that comes with a small press versus a, let's say, large publishing house that you mentioned. I guess what does that necessarily mean? If it doesn't mean that, oh, you're broadening your definition or losing some of the very specific elements by going to a large press, then I guess how would you characterize the difference in community from a small press to a large press? Is it just that you have more, freedom at a smaller press so you can niche down on your audience more, or what did you mean by that?
I think it's, yeah, I guess I can see how I'm contradicting myself by what I said, right? If the publishing context is the only thing that changes versus the community expectations of aesthetically what's going to happen. Yeah, I think, all right, let me try to answer the question. I feel like there are certain community standards or ideas of what's good or what's important in different publishing contexts, and that absolutely influences what gets published. Even though really wild things get through, things that are on the more experimental side are less likely to get published in big houses and things like that. So I think it's partially those are the communities I'm talking about, right? If you like reading literary fiction, however you want to define that, that's maybe going to be your sort of more national book award winning, like large houses, kind of prestige publishing. Versus if you like to read stuff that has more of a language focus, like you said, or is more about the writing, maybe less about the plot, something like that. That might be one aesthetic community, one way of defining aesthetic community that you'd be participating in. I also think the politics of the communities differ a little bit or a lot. I think people in this business tend to be on the left hand side of politics, but I think people are a lot more radical or extremely progressive in smaller press communities. And so, like, the politics of the work they're doing is like more disruptive and more anti-capitalist and stuff like that. Um, if there's more money involved in the publishing, like, it's harder to find people with those kinds of politics just because those are the material conditions that are influencing people's lives. So I think that has a lot to do with it too. But those are just a couple different examples, like sort of people's relationship to plot and language, and people's relationship to how they're thinking about, yeah, the way people exist in the world and what that should mean and what liberation should mean and can mean and stuff like that. Are those the kind of examples you're kind of thinking of?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the general takeaway is that I'm maybe trying to put it in more of a black and white term, but really there's nuance, and that's what your book encourages people to think about. What am I looking for? What makes sense for me? So I kind of want to ask more about, like, is how do I submit? So let's say I end up writing a little novella or something, and I have no publishing experience, and I wanna get it out there. I want people to uh, read it, and I want to go to, say, a smaller press. What does that look like? What does that process entail?
Yeah. All right. Well, um, there's a lot of things you got to do. I mean, first, revise the hell out of it, right? You just got to work on it forever. I'm also a creative writing teacher, so I have a lot of experience working with students and working with myself, trying to make my stuff the best it can possibly be. And it always takes like 10 million times as long as you think it should to make something good. But once you've done that, once you feel good about it, I think the first thing, instead of going and finding a bunch of places and then submitting to them, I think the first thing is always asking what your goals are, right? There's a lot of different possible goals. Some people, the goal is to achieve certain career recognition or something like that. So they're thinking a lot about prestige and how they can maximize the attention they get or something like that, or like well-regarded presses or something. Some people are thinking about connecting with certain communities, like they're really focused on aesthetic communities, and they're like, I know this piece is for this group of people who really influenced me, and I'm a part of that conversation already. I'm guessing if you're writing a novella, you're gonna already have some places in mind that you've read contemporary stuff from. That's one possibility. Another thing that might be a huge priority for you could be something really simple, like I just want something that has incredible graphic design. I don't care that much about distribution. I don't care that much about like how well known the press is. I just want it to look awesome, right? So you kind of get your goals in order and you figure out what's the most important thing to you. And then, you go to my book or you go to the internet or whatever, and you find places that you can possibly submit. And novella is a relatively rare form, so there's like several contests and things like that that you can submit to. But there's also a lot of open reading periods at small presses that could publish a novella. So just using those resources to sort of build a group of presses that you want to submit to. But I also give a lot of advice in this book about how to organize like your documents around submitting, like how you keep track of them, how you write your cover letter, how you want to follow up with presses or not follow up with them, how many submissions to send at a time, things like that. All those are kind of a delicate calculus that, again, really depend on your goals. But once you're in the process, you want to be thinking about that stuff, because especially with a book, it's like maybe the most precious thing you'll ever have made, from a career or work point of view. And you want to be thoughtful about that process and how you do it. So that's why I say first zoom out, think about what you want out of the process, and then do the thing that's going to especially give back to your writing. That's how I advise really making these decisions about the more logistical stuff I mentioned. What decisions are going to give back to your writing? What's going to make you feel like you want to write? What's going to make you feel at home in yourself and your creative process? That's the guidance that I give to people who are trying to answer the question of like, okay, how do I do the next step? Just do the thing that's not going to suck the energy out of you, that's not going to empty you out, but the thing that's actually going to fill you back up.
That's a good answer. And I guess on the, like, because I don't really have a background in this, so I have no idea. And, you mentioned a cover letter and you have different documents, but logistically, how does one submit? Do presses have like a form that says, hey, submit here? Or do they have a email that you can always send it to, and maybe you write a little bit about, hey, this is me and here's my, I guess, cover letter? Is it kind of like you're applying to a job or an internship, or is it slightly different?
Yeah, thanks for backing me up a little further back toward the beginning, because I get intense about this stuff, and then I started just speaking about the more logistical or philosophical aspects of it, which is why it's helpful to have like that alongside the logistical stuff in a book like this. So if you read the book, I tell you about that stuff. But yeah, on a basic level, it's you go to a form on their website, and usually you can upload the manuscript and you write a cover letter. And the difference between this and the other process is like if you're trying to publish with a big 5 house, or like get paid a little bit, get an advance and stuff like that, you'll often query agents. Really, really hard to do that for a novella. So you're making the right decision by going to small presses. If you do that, you have to write a query letter that's very pitchy and kind of gives a summary of the plot and maybe provides some comparable titles, talks a little bit about why you think it's going to be attractive to readers and why you think it might sell and stuff like that. So that's a query letter, which is a different process than the one that I'm talking about here. The process that I'm talking about here, the cover letter, is alongside your manuscript, but it's really the manuscript that's primary. And the expectation typically in this process is that you upload this form, you put a short cover letter, hey, here's who I am, here's why I'm submitting this is how many words it is, and maybe you say, like, I've really admired your press over the years, or like, I feel like this might fit with your aesthetic, if you feel a particular connection with that press. But besides that, the cover letter can be relatively spare. And then you really prioritize the writing, because the contract, or the implied contract in these publishing contexts, is that people are going to look at the work no matter what. If you have lots of qualifications, they're going to look at it. If you have no qualifications, they're going to look at it. And a lot of times people are looking for people who have less publications, less quote unquote qualifications, because they want to discover the next new writer, the next person who's doing something really exciting and who hasn't been published yet. So like you said, you submit a form, and the form is on this, usually on this sort of software called Submittable, and you press submit, and then you wait for a really long time. Usually you end up waiting 3 months to, I want to say, a year if you're submitting something like a novella. Literary magazines, they get back to you a little faster, but it can take a long time to hear back about a book. So that's why you have to be kind of strategic about how many places do you submit it to at once, like what are the tiers of submissions and stuff like that you send to. But yeah, that's the bones of how it works.
So how did you first get published? And I understand there might be different contexts, like, if it's in, let's say, a magazine, or it's, let's say a few pages as opposed to a longer work. But however you want to interpret the first, let's say, significant publishing, what was the story behind that?
Yeah. I'll tell you 2 stories. One is the first literary magazine publication that I got, and I talk about this a little bit in the intro to the book, but it was at a literary magazine called Ellie Mae, which stood for Electronic Magazine. It was in maybe 2012, something like that, maybe 2011. Pretty soon after I graduated from college, I had started writing relatively recently, and I was writing a lot of these flash fiction short pieces that were influenced by stuff that I was reading in that magazine and other books from small presses and stuff like that. And I submitted to this very simply designed magazine that had kind of a cachet in the literary magazine world, I think. I didn't really know about that stuff at the time. I just knew it was cool, it was simple, and they published like short, weird stuff. And I had been writing short, weird stuff. So I remember sending that email and submitting the work. And then just a couple days later, the editor got back to me and said, "Oh, hey, I love these. Can we publish them?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. Like, this is so amazing." And I never experienced something like that before. Somebody really valued this thing that I created just out of my own heart, out of my own self. I remember being so happy about it and so excited about it. And it was just this magical thing. And it went up online. It was, again, this really simple format, and Ellie made it look really nice. But it's not like they were blasting things out to social media. Like, social media barely existed at that time. It was just so cool to see my work in print. And I felt so awesome about it. That was my first literary magazine publication. My first book publication, like full-length book, wasn't until like 10 or 11 years later. And that's not for a lack of trying, right? Like, the literary magazine publication happened relatively fast because it's not quite as competitive of a world, and there's like more room for more pieces if things are getting published online, I think. It's just really hard to get a book published, So that was from a manuscript that I wrote and revised and revised and revised and sent out a lot of times as I continued to try to build that manuscript and try to make it better. Every time I was like, this is the final version of the manuscript. It's going to be perfect. And sometimes I would be a finalist or a semi-finalist at a contest. But then eventually I to my massive surprise, won this contest with a small press called Autumn House Press, which is an amazing press. And I was stunned that it won and that they were going to publish it. Same feeling as with Ellie Mae. I was like, oh my gosh. But I was so used to rejection by that time, because rejection is really normal and it just happens to everybody, right? Like 10 or 20 or 25 rejections before you get an acceptance is pretty normal for a piece. And for a book, I think even more than that is really normal. So I was so used to rejection by that time that when I got the letter saying that it had been accepted and that it won the contest and it was going to be published as a book, I kind of didn't believe it. I was writing at the time, actually. And I saw the note and I was like, are you sure? Yeah, are you sure? And I literally just kept writing the other thing I was writing. I was like, I'm going to keep writing. And then after I'm done with my session of writing today, I'm going to go back and I'm going to check and I'm going to see if this is still real. So I finished the writing session. I was like, all right. And then I went back to the email. I was like, oh my God. Okay. And I literally didn't know how to process it because I was just so used to no by that time. I just didn't know if that book was going to get published. I didn't know if any book was going to get published of mine ever. So I honestly had no idea how to deal with it by that point. And it's taken me a long time to be like, oh, yes, this is like really a good thing. It was such a great experience working with Autumn House, and they did an incredible job on the book. But I just had to get used to having something that great happen again. So that was two experiences, 10 years apart, two different firsts.
I think you said the first publication was around when you graduated college, right? Couple years after. So when did you start writing? Was this something that you always, ever since you were a kid, you enjoyed, writing, reading, literature? And I don't know, but I assume you studied English or something related in college?
Yeah, sort of.
Sort of, okay. When did you think that, hey, I, want to be a writer? Was it a gradual process? Like, hey, this is just something I, like doing, and over time you put more and more into it? Or was there like a defining moment that made you say, hey, this is really cool, let me pursue it?
Definitely, I was a kid who loved writing, loved reading. It was built into me from an early age. And I remember writing stories and sometimes writing poems and just being excited about that when I was younger. When I came to college, and high school too. Everything was so hard. I still wrote for my English classes and stuff like that, but I just was working really, really hard, reading the books they told me to read, and just like, oh, this is what I'm doing. So I didn't stay connected to the creative writing stuff, and I continued to not be connected to it throughout college. I studied something related to English. It was called the Interdisciplinary Project in the Humanities, and basically I ended up doing something like English. But I wrote a critical thesis, not a creative one. Like I think many like long-haired white man of my generation, I wrote a thesis about David Foster Wallace and postmodernism and trying to conceptualize what like the new sincerity was going to be, right? Um, and and then after I graduated, I didn't have to do anything anymore. Nobody was telling me what to write. Nobody was telling me like how to think about things. I could read whatever the hell I wanted. And I had to reckon with what do I actually want to do with relationship to this stuff. Meanwhile, I was, working in other capacities. I moved to Taipei and taught English there for a year and did some other jobs after that. But pretty much right when I graduated from college, I sort of decided, okay, I'm going to be a writer. I want to make this stuff. I want to make the fiction that I've been reading for a while and that's been really moving to me. And I don't want to just talk about it critically. So I made the decision after college, and I suddenly had this freedom, and I was like, that's what I want to do with it. I want to give creatively. And before I moved to Taipei, I sat in my parents' basement every day for a few hours and tried to write a novel. And it like did not go well. it was not the best series of writing sessions because it's really hard starting out figuring out what you want to write about, what it all means. But I had decided to do it, so I really wanted to make a go of it and figure out what that meant. So while a lot of students who are in college and kind of make those decisions in college or get to explore it more in college, they have the opportunity to figure out what that means with a little more guidance. I didn't really take that route because I hadn't pursued it in college. I only realized after how important it was to me to make the creative work. So I had to find my way in the dark a little bit, but that's why the community stuff has been so important to me, because my interest in writing didn't really grow out of an academic context. It kind of grew out of meeting some of these texts and seeing, like, for example, I discovered like Amelia Gray's AM PM, this great small press book that's like so weird and so funny and so hybrid. And I discovered it on the shelf of the library in Taipei. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, what is this? How is this possible? And can I do it? So those are the things that were really formative to me at a time when I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a writer.
So first I have to ask, 你会说中文吗?
EDN.
EDN, okay.
Not anymore, though.
Okay.
Yeah, do you?
I can't either. This is my little bit that I do whenever someone says that they visit it or they speak it. I ask that. They're like, oh, do you speak it? But I took lessons when I was a kid for a bit. I can pronounce things sort of, but I have like 5 phrases. So I can't actually speak it. But
I definitely thought you were going to just launch into it right there. I was like, I can pretend that I know.
It's yeah, I can pass for like 10 seconds, but that was the first. I just had to get that out. The second thing is, so you mentioned after college is when you really were like, okay, I want to be a writer. Let me try and make that happen. And, you talk about writing for hours in the basement and it being a tough thing to do, as I can imagine. It's hard to, let alone one thing, speaking properly is, how most people communicate. And it's hard to get a mastery on that. It's another thing to essentially take your thinking and polish it and put it on a page where it's static. The word, when you're interacting with people, it's transient. Like, you'll say something and then people don't really revisit it unless it's recorded. So a lot of people maybe don't put as much emphasis on how they talk, but it's another thing if you're writing, because it's there forever and people can read it and enjoy it, critique it. It's a very hard thing to do, as I can imagine. So how do you become a good writer? You decide that you want to write, and it's a tough thing. How do you get better at it? Is it like most things where, okay, obviously the more you do it, the better you're going to get, but do you need to maybe take some classes? Of course, you probably want some feedback. Is it mostly freestyle and you just, write and it's more about figuring out how to articulate yourself, or do you have to learn certain structures, improve your vocabulary? Does it depend on different people? Like, how do you become a good writer?
Yeah. I should know the answer to this question because I'm a creative writing teacher. This is really my expertise. But of course, the secret is that there's no secret, right? You just show up a bunch and do it constantly and never stop. And then suddenly you're like, oh, I'm a little better at this than I used to be, right? But I kind of break it down into three different sections of how you can do things. The first is reading. You really just have to read a lot to understand kind of the contemporary vocabulary and the contemporary grammars of storytelling or of like poem telling or whatever you're telling. Really, is necessary to help you get a grasp on the language you want to use. So reading a ton, writing a ton, obviously. I think for me, it's every day. I have just written every day whenever possible since I decided to do it. And there's really no substitute for that. And then I used to say it was just reading and writing, but community is the other thing. I really believe that it's super hard to do these things and to maintain like a passionate connection to them if you don't know other people who are also invested in that same type of work. So there's a million ways that can come through. That can come through classes, that can come through participating in like small press literary magazine stuff, like being part of a reading series, just knowing other people, having a writing group, stuff like that. So having a little bit of support and people who are going to ask you, how's the writing going? And people are going to hype you when you get something published and when you're sharing your work. People who are going to make you feel like there's a reason that you're doing it. I think it's really hard to go forward without that stuff. As much as I want to believe you can just muscle through and write and read and that's going to be enough. It's not going to be enough because eventually you're just going to say, why am I doing this, right? You need to be communicating with people and you need to know the context you're in, I think, at least for me, to be able to feel like the work is worthwhile. That's to me, that's a secret. But just showing up and doing that a lot and doing it until you don't want to anymore and then keeping doing it if you're okay with doing that. It's okay to stop if at some point you want to stop, but there's a lot of times, like I was talking about with rejection in the submission process, there's a lot of rejection. In writing, there's a lot of just quiet times where, especially if you're working on a book, you might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years not really getting a lot of public exposure or feedback for your work. So I think a really important thing is to like build a home in the process of writing and feel really excited about showing up to the page, even if it's not manifesting immediately. How can you make yourself do something for 5 years, 10 years without getting immediate feedback about it? Like if you can figure out a way to do that, you can figure out a way to become the writer that you want to be, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a lot of things, success in, I don't want to say every domain, but a lot of things, it's really a battle of attrition. And, some people get more success or they're more inclined to certain things earlier on, and some people aren't. But if you decide you want to do something and you just keep doing it, even when you maybe feel tired, you just, I'll stick at it. Eventually, usually it works out. And I like to think that's the case for pretty much anything. But what was I going to ask? What did you end with? You were talking about
Staying in the writing process, finding a way to stay with it. You were just
oh,
talking about more of attrition.
yeah, it's not actually about. It was more at the start. So you preface by saying, "Oh, I'm a creative writing teacher, so I should know the answer." And immediately I thought, how do you, in an academic setting, teach someone to, or maybe the better word is help someone get better at writing or expressing themselves? Is it, I imagine of course, you have that community aspect in the class and you want to have some reviewing, some feedback, but are you teaching them certain, structures, certain ways of thinking? You expose them to different texts. Like, what does that look like if, let's say, someone takes a creative writing or a fiction class?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like sometimes students will come into my class because it's in an academic context and they'll want the answers, right? They'll want structures. They'll want to know, like, how do you build a plot that's going to be successful, or how do you write dialogue, or how do you do X, Y, and Z. And there's books about that. There's people who have really good craft advice about it and stuff like that, even though it really varies massively based on the genres you're writing in. And the thing you can really do is just read those genres and figure out what people are doing, and then you'll get the more updated version of it. But I think that stuff's all really valid, and that's a way of increasing your maybe quickness to pick up certain things, right? It's a way of accelerating the writing process. It's almost like you've put in more hours writing if you're sort of thinking about these things actively in the community. And so I think it's really important. But for me as a teacher, I err on the side of imparting passion and imparting excitement and joy around this work, because it's so easy to say, here are the rules, here are the things that we must do, here's the things that you have to uh, think about as a writer, and the things that you have to use structurally in order to make something good. And that kind of spirit, especially because I teach fiction writing 1 a lot, and I teach creative nonfiction 1 a lot. And these are classes where it's often people's first engagement with the genre or first engagement in it in an academic context. And I find, at least from the perspective of, a person who's been a student in the past of courses like these, it shuts you down. It makes you feel like, okay, these are the rules. I have to follow them, right? And the creativity is completely gone out of the process, even though you have things you can do within those rules and stuff like that. It just makes it feel like, okay, this is a thing that I have to do. And suddenly the reason you came to it, which is because you could do whatever the hell you want to do, is gone. And what I like to try to do is open possibilities for people in my classes, to introduce them to a lot of different weird types of text that are approaching fiction, for example, in completely different ways. And then let that be an opening of the door of opportunities. Like, here are the rules they break. Here are the things that they don't do. Here are the things that are unimaginable and they don't make sense, and somehow they work, or somehow they don't work, but we still love them, right? Those are the moments to me that are really magic, because I think the one thing that you can't substitute for, and the one thing that I think will really make you successful is just loving the hell out of it. And if you love it and you can find the reason why you do it, and you can find that connection to just like a really deep creativity that is beyond those rules and things like that, if you have that, you'll figure out the rules, you'll figure out the structures that you want to participate in, you'll figure out all the other stuff. But without that, I feel like nothing's going to happen. Without that, you might stop writing. So I want people to come out of my classes having the passion. And then if we got some rules along the way, that's really good too. But especially at the beginning, like, you got to have that thing that keeps you in it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Whenever someone is getting into something, you want to nurture, it's really the word is passion, their interest in it. And oftentimes if someone is new to something, they'll come up with certain ways of thinking, or they'll be creative in a way that you really wouldn't think to be if you were following all the rules and you had internalized, okay, I have to do it this way, this way, this way. If you don't really have any restraints, oftentimes you can be creative in a very new way. And, maybe you will over time refine that by instituting not rules or things you have to do, but hey, here's a way of doing it, and let me see how I can experiment with that. So I think it's a great way of thinking about it. Going back to, let's say, refining your writing or sort of becoming a better writer, and talking about the idea of what's your goal, do you have to revise differently depending on, let's say your goal is to win a contest, right? There's a short story contest, and it's max, I don't know, 20 pages, 30 pages, and you want to get first in the contest. Does that change how you revise your work, or do you still think of it as, okay, I just need to make it as good as possible, and if so, hopefully they'll agree and then I'll win? Or do you sometimes, let's say, write to a specific, I guess it would be audience? And I'm kind of answering my own question. If you know the judges or the context, maybe you do write to a specific audience. But I guess the broader question is, does the revision process change depending on the objective and, let's say, like a contest?
I think writing is too ridiculous of a thing to choose to do in your life to make decisions based on what anybody else wants. So for me, the writing is always first. I'm like, what does this thing have to be? And then if it's the right word count, if it's the right style for somebody, whatever, then great. But for me, the great thing about knowing the expansiveness of literary community and like having connection with like this really diverse group of literary magazines, small presses, stuff like that, is that I understand that almost anything has a potential home. So I don't worry about that so much. I'm just like, I'm gonna do the thing that I need to do, even if it's completely impossible to deal with and read and get published and whatever, right? Because writing anyway, it's not gonna make you tons and tons of money unless you get super lucky. Um, so that's one way to think about it. The other answer to your question is that for me, community and context are actually really important to my writing. So even if I'm doing whatever the hell I want with no regard for whether or not it's going to get published, the things that I want to do are already in conversation with publishing context. So I think it's less likely that there would be like a particular short story contest that I would say, oh, I'm going to write toward this and try to win it or something like that. But it would be more likely that, for example, like with this book, I would see a need in the community and I would be like, oh, this is the thing I really want to communicate. And so the thing I really want to do is tell people in a systematized, like encouraging, inspiring way how to submit their writing and be a part of this kind of community. So it's sort of a double answer, right? Do whatever the hell you want, but whatever the hell you want is probably going to be most vibrant when it's already in conversation with something you see in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The art comes first, so to speak, and you're not really going to be writing just because you want to win contests. I mean, there probably are a few people who do that, but usually it's because you like to write and you have a certain vision that you want to put forth. And on that note, why be a writer? What draws you to it? Has that changed over time?
Man, like why be a writer for me or for like anybody? I've been asking people this question. I've been interviewing people on my Substack and I asked them this question, but I've never asked myself. And it's really hard to be asked that question. I feel bad for what I'm doing to people. At least for them, it's in writing. But all right, for me, what is being a writer? At the beginning and continually, it's an experience of accessing my deepest self or continually trying to access it, right? Of like pushing the boundaries of what I can create and know. I am a person who has a lot of creative energy. I want to make things. I want to do things, and that's especially like a creative impulse. I just want to make things come into the world. And so I just feel the most at home and the most alive when I'm writing something. It's like I'm communicating, I'm doing the thing that I'm supposed to be here for, you know? And that's partially a function of habit, like doing this for an hour or more a day, pretty much every day of my life for the last decade or more, has got me to the point where I sort of need it. You know, I've made myself need that time and that process. But it's also because it just fulfills this like really deep thing that I don't totally know how to fulfill in any other type of way. Uh, but it also, when you get really deep into something, I think, and I'm still relatively young, I'm not like so deep into it. I'm 36 right now. I've been writing for, I guess, 14, 15 years seriously. And I feel like at some point it just becomes the fabric. It becomes like the grammar of your life rather than the content, rather than the subject of your life, if that makes sense. Like the way that I interact with people, the way that I do things is through this experience of writing and reading and interacting with literary community. That's kind of the lens through which I experience the world. So at some point it ceases to be like a thing that happens, but it's something through which my life happens, if that makes sense. And at that point I feel like it's not that I don't have a choice. I think I have a choice, but it feels like it's just for me now, or it's there already, and that's a really good feeling.
So My follow up initially was going to be, how do you measure success as a writer? But, and it's kind of the same, but I think a better way of characterizing it is, what do you want to get out of writing, or what do you hope to achieve by writing? And you've kind of answered it. So maybe putting the label of, oh, what does success look like to you, might take it a different way, but take it how you want. Like, what do you want to get out of writing? What does success look like to you in writing? Has that changed? What are you hoping to achieve, or is it really just, hey, this is something I like doing?
I think it is the same answer for me. And I've been thinking a lot about this because, I have this book coming out. I'm trying to promote it and share it with people, and thinking about, what does it mean to be visible in certain ways in the literary world and stuff like that. And what is success, and is it important, and stuff like that. For me, real success as a writer is literally just being able to do it. Like getting up in the morning and having the opportunity to write for an hour or whatever is the most success I can imagine. Like that's the best thing. Maybe having like 3 hours a day and nothing else to do, that would be like absolutely the most success, right? If you got really, really quote unquote successful in a conventional way, then suddenly you have like an enormous amount of time to do the work. But for me, being able to show up and do the work, and having been able, really fortunately in my life, to build a situation in which I have some time to do that. I'm really busy. I have a lot going on, and that's all great too. But the fact that within the context of that, I can just show up and do this work that we're talking about, I just feel incredibly grateful for that. And I think anything beyond that, that's stuff you can't control, and it's stuff that speaks to how the world receives your work, but it's not stuff that speaks to you and who you are, right? For me, it's just about being able to be there, being able to engage in this, and being able to feel at home in that creative process. Like that's success for me.
What do you want to work on, or what types of projects do you want to, let's say, do in the coming years, months? You've had experience writing in a variety of contexts, and obviously you have your teaching as well. Going forward, and after this book comes out, and hopefully it does well, but it seems like it already has done well in the sense that you got to write it, if that makes sense. Um, what kinds of things do you want to work on going forward?
What kinds of books, or what kinds of everything? Anything. Yeah. I want to keep writing, as you can tell from my last answer. And I have a sense of it. I can be kind of cagey about what's coming next for me. But I think one is things that are more personal. I've been doing a lot of this writing about having Crohn's disease / inflammatory bowel disease, which has played a really big role in my life. And it's really personal. It's like another story, like this book, that I want to share, and that huge amount of people have in common, but isn't as commonly talked about because there's sort of taboos against talking about stuff around bowel disease. So I really want to share that work with the world and find a way to do that, kind of more publicly. And I want to work on things that are a little longer. Like my books so far have been relatively short, except for this most recent one. But this is sort of a different genre than the creative work that I've been typically publishing. So I want to let myself inhabit the process for a longer period of time. I've been in kind of an impatient writer despite these things I'm talking about, with like sitting in the process and like being in it and being comfortable in it. Like I want to write something. I want to finish the project. I want to share it with the world, And I've been really drawn to shorter books, but I'd love to spend time with something for like a long period of time and just allow myself to do that and feel good about being out of the revising and publishing phase for a while. I think that would be really nice because I've been publishing a lot of stuff recently and just relaxing the process for a while. Plus, I always get these ridiculous ideas, all of which I'll do and none of which I'll do. I have no idea. I just finished reading The Maltese Falcon last night, and it's this hard-boiled detective novel, and it just made me feel like, oh, I want to write a detective novel. Like I'm going to do it, and it's going to be so weird, and it's going to have the same kind of strange diction that he has, but it's going to be like sort of a contemporary version. Like there's so many things that spark off my imagination. So the next time that I have time, who knows what the thing is going to be that I end up seizing on. But yeah, there's so much magic out there, and the more I read, the more I'm like, oh gosh, like everything is possible. So that's kind of the feeling I'm carrying right now.
On a sort of unrelated note, this is something I've kind of been thinking about, and the way I'll put it is that we're in a time now where there have been lots of things written throughout history, and of course, obviously, with the advent of the printing press, that increased a bunch. But even a few hundred years after that, there's so many books that have been written. There's so many, novels, poems, anthologies, essays, whatever. And part of this is a two-part thing, because I guess the first part of the question depends on how you define it. So the first part will be, what does it mean to be original to you, or to put forth something new? And then the second part would be, do you think that it's much harder to do that now than, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, because there's just so much out there?
No, I don't think it's harder. And yes, I think it's possible to be original. I was thinking the question that you might be going toward was, why write in that context, in the context of like so many things in the world, right? Which I think in a way is like underlying some of the things you said. When we're faced with so much language, especially with AI and all that kind of stuff, but also the proliferation of content on the internet and the accessibility of writing and stuff like that, there's a lot of stuff out there. Like, why add your thing to the mix? And it's kind of the same question I've realized as, why speak? Like, why communicate with the people that you meet in everyday life, or the people that you love, or whatever? Why have a conversation? I think it's because it's what we do. And books, have this kind of cachet about them. They have this idea of being timeless, and they last forever, and they're always going to be a part of the world. And the truth is, everything fades, everything becomes less relevant or changes in relevance or whatever. And for me, that's actually what's beautiful about it. There's all these things that exist already, and our thing doesn't have to be the end all be all. It doesn't have to be the ultimate compendium of knowledge. Just like if you're standing talking in the kitchen while you're cooking dinner with your partner or something like that, you don't have to say the best thing. You just have to say the thing that like feels good in that moment for you and the person who's listening to you. And then that's something that offers them the opportunity to speak to. And that's kind of how I see books these days. It's something that you create, and it has this illusion of permanence. It has this illusion that it's going to last forever. But actually, it's just this beautiful, brief act that coalesces a relatively small number of people in a specific period of time. And it can be scary and sad that that's kind of impermanent and brief and limited. But to me, that's actually what's beautiful about it, because there's no other thing that can do that utterance and make that little community of readers or people having a certain conversation at that time. Like, only that book can do that, even if just a few people read it.
I really like that answer, because it made me think of, two additional ways to, let's say, frame that question. Because the first one would be, okay, do you see writing as a way of communication, or something analogous to speaking? Because let's say, why speak? The thing that I would say for that is that, obviously, of course, we're not talking about the utility of speaking. Of course, you have to speak to get by in the world. But when you're speaking with someone, usually it's just an interaction one-on-one with them. And oftentimes you can say things that are not your own idea. In fact, most people's, I don't want to say all of their ideas, but a lot of the beliefs people hold are not, let's say, original or something that they initiated. And, that's fine. But if you're speaking one-on-one with someone, it's different than, let's say, putting it out to the world to be consumed as something that is, adding to, you can characterize it as, the collection of human knowledge or human beliefs or ideas. but something that you're adding to that. But if you do see writing as primarily a form of communication or interacting, then it doesn't matter so much if there's a ton of overlap. And then the second question would be, who are you writing for? Because if it's for yourself, then that's all kind of irrelevant, right? Because you're doing it because you like to do it, and people might not have seen that idea, so let me put it out. And obviously, this is all very general, like, oh, new idea. But I think my question is, I'm kind of thinking out loud, but I guess I'll just go back to what does it mean to be original to you, or to put forth a new idea? Because I think, okay, what does that mean? Oh, something new, something someone else hasn't done. But does that mean that every book is new in a sense? Because none of them are literally the same as the others. And also, this is more relevant with AI, when you can, let's say, generate a book in a few minutes, and maybe it's not that good, maybe it is okay, maybe it's based off something else, but it makes the question of what does it mean to be original especially relevant. So what's your take on that? That's kind of a lot.
Yeah. No, it's great. I think what you were saying about things being derivative not being a problem is something I agree with. I mean, it's just, yeah, when you're doing an act of communication, a lot of times you're retelling a story that somebody told you, or you're giving your own take on an idea that you heard or whatever. And even if you tried to write the exact same thing as somebody, like, it would fundamentally be different because you would accidentally add your own thing. Borges has that story about the Quixote and how, like, this guy, like, writes the exact same thing as Cervantes, but it's completely different because of the time that he's living in and stuff like that. I think that's true. I think that you can't help but be original. When it comes to AI, it is hard, right? Because that's like fundamental derivativeness, right? Uh, and I believe that it's really nice to have people around, and have a person adding something to the picture is good. I think it's like okay to have robots around too, and they add something to the picture as well. It's just, do you want the thing that's added by the robot, or do you want the thing that's added by the person? And sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. But to me, a lot of times the thing that's added by a person is idiosyncrasy, messed upness, texture, a lack of being completely resolved. I think I love the handmadeness of a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about in these lit mag small press communities, like the way people are stitching together chapbooks or letter pressing things. That human touch, quote unquote, can be kind of a cliche, I guess, but it's not because of the thing that they're giving to you, and now you have this object and it has the human touch, and now you can, like, participate in it apart from any human or something like that. For me, it's about, there was this human touch on the product or whatever, and the whole point actually was the contact that you thereby have with maybe the person who wrote it, the person who published it, the other person who read it and appreciated it or whatever. And I think, when it's a person making things, it's a lot more likely that that conversation that results out of it, because the person is there and because they're part of the community too, you want to listen to them maybe more than you need to listen to like a robot or something. For me, the conversation suddenly becomes more dynamic. So you had kind of mentioned the question of like who you're writing for too, right? In a way, I think the writing act is about writing for the conversation. It's for the space that the text makes for people to be in. And I think that can be the originality in a way, right? Like, just showing up is what we can add to the picture.
I like that. And I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but maybe the idea that everything exists in its own context. If it's a conversation or a writing, it'll have a different community, it'll be in a different time period. So even if it is somewhat derivative. I guess you're expanding the definition of the writing to include not just the literal words on the page, but also the context in which it exists, and that might also make it more original, let's say, or even if you don't want to think like that, more of a reason to do it. I'll also add I like that you mentioned Borges. I read Labyrinths like a month ago, his collection of little stories and essays, and I like that. I don't I don't the Quixote one might have been in that. I'm not sure. I like the one from Babylon where it's like everything's up to chance, but or maybe it was Babel. I don't know. But anyway, going back to the idea of AI, how do you think I don't know if I want to say the writing space or the literature space, or how do you think writing things or what it means to be a writer will be affected by AI in the coming years, if at all? And I guess a second question would be, do you use it in your work? Do you think that most writers and authors do? Because there are kind of two ways you can tackle that. One is, what does it literally mean to be a writer mechanically? Like, oh, are we fundamentally changing how we work? And another one is there less of a need or more of a need, or does the need change for writers? So this is different ideas, just broad question. How do you think AI will change writing and being a writer going forward?
Yeah. I think these questions, they definitely veer toward this question, right? I want to interpret it coming from my own position of hearing people talk about it a lot and be worried about it and things like that. I I tend to be like, I don't know, it's not a big deal, and that's just coming from my own contrary nature in part. Not wanting to make a big deal out of the thing that everybody thinks is going to be a big deal. But I do think it's just a change in technology, like a lot of things, right? There was a time when people reading was something that you did aloud instead of silently, and then at some point, I think it was with like Augustine's Confessions, he starts talking about reading silently, and everybody was weirded out by that. And then that became like the norm or a norm for some people. And that's a huge technology change for what it looks like to participate in a text, right? And that's going to massively change how people are constructing the text and stuff like that. Computers also, right? I'm sure they have changed massively how things are written and what you can do with the word. So does AI. And it's just another technology. I guess it's a really powerful technology and it has the chance to muddy the waters a lot. But I think the main thing it'll do is cause us to reevaluate, as it's causing us to do now, what it means to be a human. And maybe being human isn't necessarily that special. Uh, Maybe it's not about being a human. Maybe it's just about being alive or existing or doing the things we do, right? But in general, like automation, not just of writing, but of like household tasks and like basically any type of labor that you can possibly imagine. Once that takes over the tasks that we're supposed to be doing on a daily basis, the question suddenly becomes like, why do we do anything? Right. And nobody's just going to stop doing things. I don't know. Some people might, and it'd be nice to have more rest. I think we could all use it. But at the end of the day, you get enough rest, at some point you're probably going to want to do something. And the question is, what is that? For a lot of writers, I think it's writing, because they got to fight to do it anyway, even when they're super busy. And I think probably more people in a context of like a more automated life would do writing, would do art, things like that. Because I think those are the things that people are drawn to do regardless of, the output or their sense of like how much they need to contribute to the conversation or whatever. So I think it could be a good thing. And in a way, it doesn't matter because, what matters is like showing up for each other, showing up for ourselves, and trying to channel the deep thing and come toward that. If AI can help us with that, that's awesome. If it doesn't help us with that, we don't have to participate in it. Yeah.
I think that's a good note to end on. How to submit coming out next month. Where can people go get it?
Anywhere is good. It's available at all the major retailers. I'll hold up a copy of the book for fear of being cheesy. But this is what it looks like, and it's coming out February 25th. So super grateful to have this conversation with you, Will. Really appreciate your questions. It's really fun to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, likewise, and thank you for taking the time.
Take care. Bye, everyone.